So today started off with pulling the front radiator support off this car and all of the headlight cages, and it is going to be transferred over to that car in the background there. So pulled all the pieces off here, and that's it just sitting over there. So that's the full panel. So it's just tack welded. So little spots of weld have all been drilled out, and it's going to go straight back onto here and it'll be drilled back in. So this is a piece off the other car, the donor car, just to make sure everything all lines up. We'll put some fenders on tomorrow to make sure everything lines up nicely. But yeah, it's a good start. We've managed to cut off pretty much the whole front and made it all up. So you can see there, we've just, same deal, you drill out all the holes and it pops the welds out, and then we just pull those whole panels off. Nissans in particular, they have many different layers of metal. So you can kind of see there's 1 and 2 and then 3 layers. So a lot of different pieces of metal in these particular cars. Managed to pull it all apart. It's turned out to be quite a simple kind of job, so it will be quite cheap. So we'll pull off the front section of that car and we'll swap all of that onto our car up the back there. So back again today, just doing a bit more work on the R34. We've got the front end finally repaired, so we're going to start just mocking things up and make sure it all fits back together. The guy who's repaired this has done a bit of a mock-up already, so hopefully it all goes back together. So I've got all back together. We've taken the front end of this car here and put it onto our final car. So sorry I couldn't record most of the process. The guy just kind of wanted to work in peace, and I've had other stuff to do while he's been working anyway, but all back together. And yeah, it's looking really good. So he's actually done a really awesome job at making sure it all lines up. You know, he test fit our fenders and everything to make sure all the bolts line up. So everything line up really well. You know, he's made it look really nice. Just for the fact that it will be re-inspected by the transport department, and we want to make sure it looks as nice as possible. The transport department, you know, they want to see welds. They don't care how it looks at the end of the day, as long as it looks solid and he can see that it's been welded back together again. That's all they want to see. So yeah, it turned out really well, really happy with it. Guy did it super cheap as well. It ended up costing me $1,000, which for this kind of work, very cheap. Luckily he's just a guy that I know, and he was happy to do it cheaper for us. But there's a look at how we're looking now, just like a normal 34 again. And obviously there's one that we've taken it off. So I'll be taking the wheels off that car there, and I will be stripping out all the interior, and this car's going to go back up for sale. So if anyone's interested, probably going to be going for about $500. It'll be up on the Facebook marketplace. So hopefully that'll be gone soon. That'll free up a bit more room. And then obviously our car over there, the engine's going to be coming out of that really soon. So I'll be recording most of that, get a few time lapses in there, pull that engine out, put it into our now good car. And then this will be running and driving. Obviously it's got most of its interior. So all the seats, AC controls and stuff are all there. I'll chuck all that back together soon. The interior is going to be complete. Have to do a bit more cleanup. Swap some body looms, some interior looms, all that kind of stuff, and then it'll all be back together and looking really good again. So a bit of a close-up, you can see where he's unpicked the weld and re-welded it, and then just put a bit of grey paint over the top to make it look nice. Yeah, he's done an amazing job. Everything lines up perfectly. I was thinking this was going to be, you know, a $3,000 job. He's done it super cheap for me. He's done amazing work. The car's perfectly straight again. There's no rust through the rest of the car. Everything looks good, so we'll get the engine into it, put the gearbox in. Hopefully in a couple of weeks this car's going to be driving and we can make it to the Power Cruise event. So like you would have just heard me say, Power Cruise is coming up soon. So Power Cruise is an event that's held at the Queensland Raceway. They do it every 3 or 4 months or so. I've really wanted to go there for a while. I've just never had a car for it. So obviously this will be running by then. It's in, I think it's September 10th or 11th when it'll be running. So we'll get this car finished and hopefully we can make it to Power Cruise. They want your cars to be looking at a show standard. Ours obviously isn't. It's got all the mismatched panels and everything. So not a show car by any means, but it'll be running. It'll sound pretty cool. Hopefully they'll let us in. It's all just waiting and seeing at the moment. So there's a fair bit of work to do. I've got to pull the engine out of that other car out the front there. And like you can see, I've just pulled out the front Rio support and the bumper supports. So they've come off the other car, and I will be swapping that onto this car here. Luckily, the guy who did all the work for me was real good. He actually fixed up our bumper support because they were all quite crunched up from the other accident. So he fixed all that up for us, no extra charge. If you do want to get any work done that's going to be to a high standard, let me know, because he does an awesome job. He's done a bit of work for us in the past at this workshop, and can't fault him. Really great guy. Awesome to work around, good guy to talk to, and his quality of work is amazing. He does an awesome job. I've probably said it a few times now, but yeah, highly recommend him. So fast forward a day and this car has already been sold. So being sold as it is, I'm going to be taking the door off it just because it's got the door regulator. They're worth a bit of money, and my current car doesn't actually have one, so I'll take that. I'm going to take the steering wheel out of it, and there's a few tiny little bits and pieces I'm going to grab off it, but the rest of it's there for him. He only needed it, the guy who's bought it, for his GTR. He's had a bit of a front hit. He needs a few seals, so that little rubber grommet in there he needs, and there's a fuse box in the inside, so he only needs 2 bits, but he thought just to save himself the drama he'll grab the whole car. So that's one of them gone. Still got 2 more to go. So today, finally getting stuck into this car. I'm going to be pulling out the rear subframe, diff, exhaust, transmission, tail shaft, all of those parts, and just sitting those aside, and then I'll be pulling the engine out. Hopefully all of that will be out today. I record as much as I can. It's just hard to record and work at the same time, so I'll see how I go. So one of the first things you should do every time you're pulling apart engines, you're disconnecting gearboxes, especially playing with starter motors, just to save your car from damaging any electronics and yourself, just take your negative terminal off the battery. It takes about 2 seconds and it's always worth doing. So quite simple, you just want to undo the nut on the end of the terminal and then just pull the whole thing out of the way and make sure it doesn't touch your positive. So just sit it right out of the way, just so it's away from your positive terminal. You don't want those two touching. So because I'm pulling everything out of this car and transferring it into the other car, I'm going to completely pull out the battery. So disconnect both terminals, take out your battery clamp, which is usually just 2 10mm bolts or a wing nut. So undo those, just grab your battery, pull that out of the way. I'm just going to leave this one on charge just because it's been sitting in the car uncharged for a while, so I'll put that aside. Next thing is going to be pulling the bonnet off and out of the way, just so it clears up some room for us. Quite simple. 2 bolts on each side at the 2 hinges. Undo those 2, release a few wires if you've still got your washer bottle connected. Obviously mine's already out, so that's going to be fine. Usually a good kind of practice is to have one person on each side, the rag on their hand, just holding the corner to save it from being damaged. Obviously it's already quite damaged, so not going to matter too much. I'll just do it myself and just pull it off all as one piece. Lucky thing about the bonnets on the R34s is as long as you have the stay up, they're only nuts that hold them in rather than being bolts. So you can just undo the nuts and it makes it a lot easier to pull it out and to line it back up again. So there's our bonnet off and out of the way. So clears it up a lot in the engine bay, makes it a lot easier to work on. Bonnet's actually in quite good condition, so we might actually keep that one and use that. It's obviously got a little dent that we need to fix, but yeah, it looks like it's in half decent condition. So a bit of a funny story, the guy who just came and picked up the other 34, which I was getting rid of on the tow truck, he was actually the same guy who towed away my car about New Year's last year. I had an accident back then in one of my old 350Zs, and the same guy who actually towed my car away just took away the 34. So the guy who bought the car is a wrecker / importer in Nerang. He only needed a couple of bits and pieces, but he ended up just buying the whole car just because it was quite cheap and I wanted to get rid of it. So he took it away, and he'll be pulling off what he needs for his GTR. There's a few little bits and pieces, and then the rest he'll just wreck out. But no, he's a really good guy. It's JDM Garage in Nerang. So Brad from there, shout out to you, really great guy, cool to talk with. He's going to drop back my rims that are on the current car and a few other bits and pieces. But yeah, cheers to Brad at JDM Garage, obviously for coming and getting the car so quick. Yeah, just a good guy to chat to. Obviously good to know people in the trade, so shout out to him. Next kind of thing I'm going to do is pull off all of the factory air intake. They're always easy to pull off, and it just really opens up the engine bay so you can see what you're working with. And then it'll just be pulling off vacuum lines, taking a few photos so I know where they all go. Just makes it easy to put back together. I'll pull off a few fuel lines, obviously mark all those. I'll get the rest of the coolant out, drop the oil, and then most of it should be pretty well ready to come out. There's not a heap of electrical connections because I will be just pulling the whole loom out, so hopefully that'll make things a bit easier, but we'll see how we go. So I've just pulled out the whole intake section and given it a good clean out. It was quite dusty just because it's been sitting around for a while, so cleaned it all out. Bit of MAF sensor cleaner on the MAF section of it just to make sure everything's all running well. Next step, we'll be pulling out the headers. This has got long tube headers on it, so they run right back to about halfway under the car, so hopefully if everything goes to plan, I'll just be undoing those studs and then it should just drop out and out of the way, but we'll wait and see. So I've got the full exhaust manifold off and the rest of the exhaust. So there's the manifold, obviously the long tube headers. They were a pain to take out, but got them eventually. So that opens up this side of the engine. It's quite dark down there, but a couple of heater hoses I'll have to undo and then should have access to the bell housing bolts and can drop the gearbox out. So I've got the coolant draining. While that's draining out, I'm going to disconnect the exhaust system. So I've started with this flange just at the front there and big straight pipe that runs down to the back. So there's about 3 hangers on the way back. I've got one up here, one just in front of the muffler, and then one about halfway down. We'll disconnect those before we drop the engine out, but I'll pull the transmission out separately and drop the whole rear subframe. So I've pulled off the back section of the exhaust, which runs right back to the muffler. So that section's off. I've just started undoing some plugs from the transmission. So 2 plugs up there that have been undone, and I've started going around undoing the bell housing bolts. Pop the slave cylinder out, so that's just going to be hanging there. I'll pull that out a bit later. So it's hard to record and do all this at the same time, so I'll just kind of show you after I've done it, just so you can have a rough idea of what I've been doing. But now it's going to drop the car down and go in from the top, take the starter out, and then hopefully be able to disconnect the rest of the bell housing bolts and pull it all out. So going back underneath the car, we've discovered that this has the upgraded suspension and brakes out of the turbo model. So it's got the 2-pot rear and 4-pot front brakes. So we'll be pulling out the whole subframe as it is and direct swapping it onto our main 34. First thing we're going to do is pull out the tail shaft and just clear up some room around the diff. So I'm just going to pull out these bolts here. There's 4 of those. They're just 14mm on this particular car. So spanner on each side, just crack those. If they are tight, just pop a pry bar through the middle of the uni joint just to hold it tight. And then you can pop off those nuts. Once those pop out, the whole tail shaft will drop down and just slides out from the gearbox. It's on that side there. So every car is going to be different, but with this particular model, undo the uni joint at the back and then the tail shaft will just slide right out. There's a good chance that it's going to drip transmission fluid as well, so make sure you've got a drip tray ready underneath the end of the gearbox. So the good thing about pulling out the rear cradle as a whole is that we don't have to go and disconnect things like sway bars and exhaust hangers. They can all stay in there. Same with the diff, all those parts will come down as one. So we've got 6 bolts in the front, there's just 3 on each side, 3 big nuts. We'll pop those out, and then in the rear end of the car, we've got the same deal. We've got a nut on each side, and then that should all drop out. There's probably gonna be a few more that I've missed, but we'll start with those to drop those out. We'll have to pull the 2 nuts off the top of the shocks, and that'll all drop out with it. So we'll get started. So like I was saying, on the back section of the tail shaft, there's going to be 4 nuts and bolts. So you're just going to get your 14mm spanner on one side, another spanner on the other side, and just crack those. I just start by cracking each bolt one at a time, just so you know that they're all going to be loose and that they can come off. So now that we've cracked those, you can just undo those bolts by hand, and you will want to keep a hold of these because they are hard to come by if you do lose them, and you need a special type of bolt, as they've got a special locating lug on them. So don't lose these, definitely keep those aside so you know where they are. So now that we've got those 4 bolts out, that's just released the uni joint from the diff. And we want to move up to this next section down here. This is just a mount for the tail shaft. This particular tail shaft, I believe it's custom made or it's out of a different model, as it doesn't use the middle bearing. So you can just see up in there, it's got 2 studs. And usually I do have another tail shaft which uses those. So this might just be a custom tail shaft out of another one. We're just going to pull off this mount here. Just going to use the socket on a gun to make it easier. So now that those 4 are undone, luckily these are just on studs so it holds the weight of it. But you just want to lift up your tail shaft to release the weight, pull the bracket out of the way, put that aside. And now you should be able to just pull your tail shaft straight out of the gearbox. So that just slides out of the end there. Luckily the seal's in pretty good condition in this one, like you can see, just in the end of the gearbox there. So there will be a bit of seepage, but it's not going to be a lot of leakage. And I've just put a drip tray directly underneath it. So we're just going to start pulling some stuff out of inside the car and get the carpet out of it. Our other car doesn't have any carpet, and we're going to use the carpet for this one. So a fair bit of glass in here and stuff that we need to pull out. So I'm going to pull out all the guards. There's a few interior bits and pieces that we'll pull out. And then hopefully we'll be able to pull the carpet out, give it a good clean up, and hopefully it comes up all right. So I've got all the big bulky stuff out of the back, and we've just started putting all the glass into little piles just so we can clean it up. Just going to get a dustpan and brush and just clean all that out of the way, and then the carpet should be good to come out. Doesn't look like there's much obstructing it. There's a few little interior bits up to the front there, so we'll pull those out and then pull the whole carpet with it. So we've managed to get the gearbox out. One thing I didn't show, which was a drama with this, is that you do need to pull the whole shifter assembly out. So you just go from the top, and there's a big circlip that holds it in, pop that out, and the whole linkage just pops out, and then it slides out, no worries. Apart from that, it was a pretty straightforward process. Just take all the bell housing bolts off, disconnect the transmission mount, which you would have seen, and then it pretty much just drops straight out of place with a fair bit of wiggling. So now that the transmission's out of the way, I'm just going to undo the engine mounts from underneath. So just 2 bolts on each side, and then we should be able to just pull the engine up from up top. I'm pretty sure we've undone everything else, but we'll find out on the way up. So it's come to the end of the day and we've got the engine out. Took us a bit longer than expected because we didn't have access to an engine crane, so we had to use a hoist arm. Made the process a bit longer, and we struggled to find decent places to chain to actually lift it up, but got it out eventually, like you saw in a few of the time lapses earlier. But yeah, we're just going to start changing over some rocker cover gaskets, doing all that kind of stuff. So we've got rocker cover gaskets, exhaust manifold gaskets, got a new radiator cap, a few other bits and pieces that we'll be putting on. So the next video will just be doing that kind of stuff, and then hopefully dropping it back in, just getting everything prepped. So prepping the engine bay on the other 34, prepping this engine to go back in, giving it a good clean down, and yeah, we'll get back into it in the next video. Catch you later.